Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator this afternoon, Edward Struzik.
Hello, all.
Hi. So Ed is a previous RCISceince Fleming Medal recipient, which is fantastic. So he's familiar with RCISceince. He's an established writer, educator, public speaker, and a fellow at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy in the School of Policy Studies at Queen's in Kingston, Ontario. His many articles and essays appear in journals, magazines, and newspapers such as Scientific American, Natural History, National Geographic, Los Angeles Times, Globe and Mail, National Post, the list goes on. He's an award-winning author with 6 books under his belt. Firestorm, How Wildfire Will Shape Our Future, won the Science and Society Book Award in 2018 and is featured in our Fall Reads Book Club. So if you haven't been part of our book club, now's your chance to join. Take it away, Ed.
Okay, well, let me just start off by telling you how we got to where we are right now. And we'll just start with a simple equation. What's required to start a wildfire? Basically 3 things: oxygen, heat, and fuel. So before the Europeans arrived on the scene, we know from charcoal records derived from lake sediments and peats at hundreds of sites around the world that there was a distinct lull in burning from around 1600 to 1750. And that lull in fire occurred during the Little Ice Age, sometime between 1500 to 1850, when temperatures in North America, Britain, and Scandinavia dropped by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. We know that lightning strikes accounted for an unknown but significant number of fires before the arrival of Europeans, and presumably many of these fires loomed large because resources were not there to suppress them. We just didn't have firefighters on the ground. We also know that humans were also part of the fire equation. Indigenous people routinely lit fires to clear the land in order to attract game and to nurture the growth of berries and root vegetables. Europeans really didn't understand that. They had a hard time coming to grips with this burning of the grasslands and the forest. And John Sullivan summed it up. He was with the Palliser expedition in 1860. He said, "It is most lamentable to see so often such masses of valuable timber destroyed, almost invariably by wanton carelessness and mischief. Unfortunately, the Indians have a most disastrous habit of setting the prairie on fire for the most trivial and worse than usual reasons." It's understandable to some extent. Most of the early settlers came from Great Britain, where there were few, if any, wildfires of significance, and they arrived at a time when that Little Ice Age brought cool, wet weather to the east coast of North America. But then a new reality unfolded as that Little Ice Age sputtered to an end. Higher temperatures and more lightning set the stage for big fires in forested landscapes that were rapidly filling up with people. And a big fire such as Miramichi, which burned in Maine and New Brunswick in 1825, was inevitable. And you look at it, Fort McMurray, which was a huge fire, 1.5 million acres burned. Miramichi was 3 times that size. And of course, no one knew how to deal with a fire as big as Miramichi because they'd never seen anything like it. And this is one recollection from the past. Those fortunate enough to be near a river took refuge in the water, often trying to coax their cows and pigs with them. The livestock were panicked by the smoke and the flames and refused to enter. Most of them succumbed to the heat and smoke. Wild animals had no such fear of water. Humans in the river found themselves surrounded by wildlife, including raccoons, deer, bears, and even large moose. And then as it got hotter and drier, big fires followed with increasing frequency. The Peshtigo fire in 1871 in northern Wisconsin killed 2,400 people. The Great Fire of 1908 in Fernie, British Columbia killed 22 people. The Porcupine Wildfire of 1911 in Ontario, 200 dead. Newspaper quote here from the Toronto Star: "A fire tornado sucked the oxygen out of the atmosphere with such force that mature trees were ripped from the ground. People who took refuge in the mine shafts were asphyxiated. Others drowned when a boxcar of dynamite exploded by the shores of Porcupine Lake. The wealthy owner of one of the mines in the region died trying to save his cat." And then there was the biggest fire, the most disastrous fire of them all, the Matheson Fire in northern Ontario in 1916. Officially, 223 people died, probably a lot more than that. But the fire that really defined our history of fire is the fire of 1910, where 1,736 small fires were smoldering in northern Idaho and western Montana, and many more in southern BC and Alberta. Hurricane-force winds blew in late that summer, burning 3 million acres in just 3 days. 86 people died. Probably thousands would have had the army not come in and the railway companies not come in to help. And by this time, people started to think that maybe we've got to figure out how to learn to live with fire. One of them was California timber harvester George Hoxsey, who said, we had best adopt fire as our servant, otherwise it will be our master. And he had a lot of support. He suggested that we do what Indigenous people did, light small fires to reduce the amount of fuel that could burn in the forest. And the state engineer of California was in favor of it. A lot of timber owners were in favor of it. The Southern Pacific Railroad was in favor of it. He may have prevailed if the fourth element not been added to the fire triangle following the big burn of 1910, politics. The big burn of 1910 ignited a culture of wildfire suppression. Politically, something had to be done to adapt to this new reality. Henry Graves, who was the U.S. Forest Service chief from 1910 to 1920, said that forest fire protection is the first measure necessary for the successful practice of forestry. And those people who support the doctrine of light burning, which he called nothing less than the advocacy of forest destruction, and those who preach that doctrine have a large share of responsibility for fires which their influences caused. And on our side of the border, Bernard Furneaux, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto and a member of the Government of Canada's Commission of Conservation, he saw fire in a similar way as the worst enemy, and forests as crops that need to be harvested, not burned, and conflagrations are due largely to bad habits and loose morals. It became a religious thing. So in the decades that followed, a number of strategies were implemented on both sides of the border to reduce the amount of fire on the landscape. What's the first thing that we did? Well, we kicked First Nations people out of national parks such as Yellowstone and Yosemite, as well as Banff and Jasper and Riding Mountain National Park. A more organized, institutionalized forest fire fighting strategy was put into place. We built fire lookouts. Tree phones were used to communicate the location of a fire to a wildfire control center that dispatched firefighters by foot, by horse, by truck, by boat even, by rail car, by train. We even had the Royal Canadian Air Force pilots being deployed to find fires. And the Canadian Mounties set up fire crews. Parks Canada set up a national firefighting training program. Civilians on both sides of the border were encouraged to participate. And then we got Smokey the Bear, who became the North American symbol of the effort to promote forest fire prevention. And just as importantly, science added sophistication to fire suppression strategies. We got to be very successful in suppressing fires for the 80, 90 years following the big burn of 1910. And you can see the numbers in the US between 1920 and 1950, 10 to 50 million acres burned annually in the US. By the 1950s, it was low as 1.9 million acres. Something had to give with so much fuel on the ground. The century-long demonization of fire continued until 1988, when the U.S. National Park Service officially allowed lightning-triggered fires in Yellowstone to burn. And the timing was unfortunate, because the fires that burned during that summer put fear in the hearts of decision makers and a public that had all but forgotten or had never heard of the Great Fire of 1910. Newspaper headlines thought that Yellowstone, a national icon, would be lost forever. President Reagan was very angry. He dismissed the relatively new let burn policy in Yellowstone as cockamamie, and he sent his Interior Secretary into Yellowstone to see what was going on, and he described it as absurd, and he ordered national park officials to fight all fires from that point on. Time, of course, proved them to be wrong. Grizzly bears and black bears immediately moved into the burned areas to feed on carrion. Fire beetles moved in to lay their eggs on warm stumps. Nighthawks and woodpeckers fed on the beetles. Owls nested in the snags, feeding their chicks rodents that were more exposed in fire-scarred areas. Aspen shoots shot up even as the fires smoldered. Elk and bison moved in to feed on aspen shoots. The coniferous trees followed, and grizzly bears fattened up on root berries that thrived in burned out areas where the sun was able to shine through to the ground. 30 years later, it's hard to detect any evidence of that fire. But then we have a new paradigm that's unfolding, and that's climate change. With climate change, we're getting more lightning. You look at the equation, it's approximately 1 degree increase in temperature results in about 12% increase in lightning. We're also getting more powerful wind events, extended droughts, disease, and more insect invasions such as the mountain pine beetle. And combined together, they're beginning to test the limits of our firefighting resources, as we've been seeing with the destructive fires that have been burning more often. Slave Lake, Alberta, 2011. Fort McMurray, 2016. BC had its worst fire season in 2017. 2018 was one of Ontario's most costly. And then we all know from the newspaper headlines what happened in Australia earlier this year and what's currently happening in California right now. So with us this afternoon, we've got some people who are going to tell us, some experts who are going to tell us how is this going to play out. Jane Park is a fire vegetation specialist for the Banfield unit at Parks Canada. Dr. Stephanie Montesanti is the associate professor of School of Public Health at the University of Alberta and also a scientist for the Center for Health Communities, the School of Public Health. And Dr. Sophie Wilkinson is a postdoctoral fellow at Eco-Hydrology Group, the School of Geography and Earth Sciences at McMaster University. So we shall hear from them.